The Music Academy stood on one of the oldest streets in the city. The building was beautiful in a quiet way, with tall windows, stone walls, and a wooden front door that had been opened by thousands of students over the years. Every morning, the street came alive with the sound of footsteps, car engines, laughter, and sometimes the soft sound of piano notes escaping through open windows. Parents dropped their children off with bags full of books and sheet music. Teenagers rushed inside, talking about practice sessions, upcoming performances, and teachers who expected perfection. Inside the academy, every hallway carried music. One room held the sound of a violin warming up. Another carried the deep voice of a cello. Somewhere upstairs, someone always seemed to be practicing scales on a piano, sometimes perfectly, sometimes not. The building was never truly silent. Even late in the evening, when most lights were off, a few notes always seemed to remain in the air. Among all the teachers, students, and visitors who walked through those halls every day, there was one person almost nobody truly noticed. She arrived before sunrise, long before the first student stepped through the doors. While the street outside was still quiet and the city was waking up, she would already be there with her small bag in one hand and a ring of old keys in the other. She always wore simple clothes. Nothing bright. Nothing expensive. Her shoes were old but clean. Her hair was tied back neatly, and her face carried the calm look of someone who had learned how to stay unnoticed. She moved quietly through the building, unlocking doors, turning on lights, and preparing each room before anyone arrived. By the time students entered the academy, every classroom was ready. Chairs were straight. Music stands were lined up. Floors were spotless. Pianos were dust-free, their black surfaces shining softly under the morning lights. Most people never thought about who made all of that happen. Students passed her in the hall with rushed footsteps and busy minds. Some gave her a quick nod. Some didn't look at her at all. Teachers often walked by while discussing additions, lesson plans, and performances, barely noticing the quiet woman standing only a few feet away. She never seemed bothered. If someone asked for help finding a classroom, she quietly pointed them in the right direction. If a student dropped papers in the hallway, she helped pick them up with a gentle smile. If a parent looked confused, she politely showed them where to wait. She never asked for attention. She never tried to be part of conversations. To most people, she was simply part of the building, like the walls, like the lights, like the wooden floors beneath their feet. Always there, always silent, always working. But there was something unusual about her. A few students had noticed it before, though none of them fully understood what it meant. Whenever piano music floated through the halls, she always paused, sometimes only for a second, sometimes for longer. If a beginner played simple scales, she listened. If an advanced student practiced a difficult piece, she listened even more closely. Her eyes would become distant, as if the music was taking her somewhere far away. Her hands sometimes stopped moving completely, even if she was holding a cleaning cloth or a stack of papers. Then, after a few quiet seconds, she would return to her work as if nothing had happened. Some students noticed. A young boy once whispered to his friend, "Why does she always stop when someone plays piano?" His friend shrugged. "Maybe she just likes music." That was the end of the conversation. No one asked her directly. No one thought it mattered. The academy itself cared deeply about talent. Every teacher wanted their students to shine. Every recital was treated like a major event. Mistakes were corrected quickly. Weaknesses were pointed out immediately. Excellence was expected. One of the strictest piano teachers believed discipline was more important than emotion. He walked through the halls with sharp steps and sharper eyes, always watching, always judging. Students sat straighter when he entered a room. Even other teachers chose their words carefully around him. He believed talent had to be proven. Nothing else mattered. One morning, he entered a practice room and frowned at the fingerprints on the piano lid. Without saying hello, he stepped back into the hallway. "The piano in room 7 isn't polished properly," he said sharply. The quiet woman was mopping near the stairs. She looked up immediately. "I'll fix it right away," she said softly. He gave a short nod and walked away without another word. She carried her cloth upstairs and entered room 7. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, lighting up the black grand piano in the center of the room. Dust was almost impossible to see unless someone looked closely. She stood beside the instrument for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the polished surface. The room was empty, silent, peaceful. She looked toward the closed door, then toward the piano keys. Slowly, almost carefully, she sat down on the bench. Her fingers hovered above the keys but never touched them. Not yet. Instead, she closed her eyes. A deep breath entered her lungs. Then another. For a moment it looked like she might play. But after a few seconds, she opened her eyes again, stood up quietly, and returned to her work. As if some invisible memory had stopped her. As if something inside her still wasn't ready. Days passed. Then weeks. Life at the academy continued the same way it always had. Students practiced. Teachers criticized. Parents waited. Performances were planned. And the quiet woman kept working. Always in the background. Always unnoticed. But there were small moments that made people curious. One afternoon, a teenage student sat crying outside a practice room after failing to play a difficult piece correctly. Her teacher had walked away in frustration, leaving her alone with tears in her eyes. The quiet woman happened to be passing by with a basket of folded cloths. She stopped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the woman sat beside her. "You love music, don't you?" she asked softly. The student wiped her eyes and nodded. "Then don't let one bad day tell you who you are." The student looked at her, surprised. The words were simple, but somehow they felt different, real, as if they came from someone who understood far more than she said. Before the student could ask anything, the woman stood up, smiled gently, and continued walking down the hall. The student watched her disappear around the corner. Something about her felt mysterious, familiar even, but she couldn't explain why. As spring slowly turned into summer, the academy announced its biggest event of the year, a public music showcase. Posters appeared on walls. Teachers grew more serious. Students practiced harder than ever. Important guests from the city would attend. Some local reporters were expected. Parents began reserving seats weeks in advance. The academy buzzed with excitement and pressure. Every hallway seemed louder. Every classroom seemed busier. Every mistake felt bigger. Late one evening, long after students had gone home and most teachers had left, the building became quiet again. Only a few lights remained on. The quiet woman moved through the empty halls with a small bucket and cloth, finishing the last of her work. Outside, the sun had disappeared. Inside, shadows stretched across the wooden floors. She finished cleaning the final classroom and stood silently in the hallway. Somewhere in the distance, a piano sat alone in one of the practice rooms. Waiting, she looked toward the soundless hallway. No footsteps, no voices, no teachers, no students, just silence. For a long moment, she stood completely still. Then, very slowly, she began walking toward the piano room. Her footsteps were almost impossible to hear. And for the first time in many years, she didn't turn away. The hallway was almost dark now. Only a few warm lights remained on, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The music academy felt completely different at night. During the day it was full of voices, footsteps, laughter, nervous mistakes, and teachers calling out instructions. But at this hour, the building felt peaceful, almost like it was finally breathing after a long day. The quiet woman walked slowly toward the practice room at the end of the second floor. In one hand she still held the cleaning cloth she had forgotten to put away. Her footsteps were soft, careful, almost hesitant. It had been years since she had allowed herself to walk toward a piano like this. Every step seemed to bring back memories she had spent a long time trying to hide. The smell of old wood, the faint shine of polished black instruments, the silent promise hidden behind ivory keys. She stopped outside the practice room. The door was slightly open. A thin line of warm light stretched across the hallway floor. She looked around one last time. No voices, no movement, no one watching. Slowly, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was simple. A grand piano stood in the center under a hanging light. Music books filled the shelves against the walls. A few empty chairs faced the piano, as if invisible listeners were waiting. The night outside pressed gently against the tall windows. She placed the cloth on a nearby table and walked toward the piano. For a moment, she simply stood there. Her fingers moved lightly across the edge of the instrument, almost like greeting an old friend after many years apart. Her expression softened in a way nobody at the academy had ever seen before. Then she sat down. The bench gave a quiet creak beneath her. She looked at the keys. White, black, familiar. Her hands hovered above them, trembling slightly. Her breathing grew slower. Her eyes closed. And then, she played. The first note was soft. So soft that it almost disappeared into the room. Then came another. And another. Within seconds, the room filled with music so rich and beautiful that it didn't sound like practice. Sounded like a story. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence, gliding across the keys as if they had never stopped. Every note carried feeling. Every pause had meaning. The melody rose and fell like memories coming back to life. There were no sheet pages in front of her. No instructions. No audience. Only music. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to disappear inside it. She forgot the cleaning bucket in the hallway. She forgot the empty building. She forgot the years of silence. She forgot the people who had looked through her as if she were invisible. In that moment, she was not a cleaner. She was simply herself. Downstairs, one of the piano teachers had returned to his office after forgetting a folder of student papers. He walked through the quiet halls with tired steps, thinking only about tomorrow's lessons. Then he stopped. A sound drifted through the building. Piano music. He frowned. At first, he assumed one of the advanced students had stayed late. But something about the playing made him pause. This wasn't a student making corrections. This wasn't someone practicing scales. This was different. He slowly turned toward the stairs. The music continued, growing stronger, deeper, more emotional with every passing second. His expression changed from annoyance to confusion, then to curiosity. He climbed the stairs quietly. Halfway up, another teacher entering from the back office heard the same music. She stopped. "Who's playing?" she whispered. The first teacher shook his head. Neither of them spoke again. They simply followed the sound. By the time they reached the second floor, 2 more teachers had joined them. All of them moved quietly now, almost afraid to disturb whatever they were hearing. The music pulled them down the hallway like a secret. When they finally reached the practice room, the door was still slightly open. Warm light spilled into the hall, and the music continued. One teacher slowly pushed the door wider. Then all 4 of them froze. Sitting at the grand piano was the quiet woman, the same woman they passed every day without a second thought. The same woman who cleaned their classrooms, polished their instruments, and quietly disappeared into the background. Her eyes were closed. Her face was calm. Her hands moved across the piano with effortless precision. Not a single note was wrong. Not a single movement looked uncertain. She wasn't just playing well. She was playing at a level none of them expected to hear in an empty academy at night. One teacher's mouth slowly fell open. Another stared in complete disbelief. The strict piano instructor narrowed his eyes, saying nothing. They stood there in silence as the music filled the room. Even the air felt different. None of them wanted to interrupt. For several long minutes, nobody moved. Then the final note faded into silence. Her hands rested gently on the keys. Her breathing remained calm. She opened her eyes and saw them standing there. Her entire body went still. For a second, nobody spoke. Then one teacher finally whispered, "What was that?" She immediately stood up from the bench. Her calm expression disappeared, replaced by quiet discomfort. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I thought everyone had gone home." No one answered right away. The teachers simply stared. The strict instructor took a few steps forward. His voice was sharp, controlled, almost suspicious. How long have you been playing? She lowered her eyes. A long time ago. That's not what I asked. She remained silent. Another teacher looked at her with genuine surprise. Why didn't anyone know? She gave a small, almost sad smile. Because nobody asked. The hallway became completely silent. For a brief moment, no one knew what to say. Then one younger teacher smiled nervously. Well, that was impressive. But the strict instructor didn't smile. His expression had become harder, more focused, almost challenged. He walked toward the piano and looked at the keys she had just touched. Then back at her. You expect us to believe you can play like that after years away from music? She didn't answer. He crossed his arms. Anyone can memorize one piece. The other teachers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The woman looked down at her hands. I wasn't trying to prove anything, but he barely seemed to hear her. Instead, an idea was already forming in his mind. Tomorrow the academy would be full again. Students would talk. Rumors would spread. Questions would come. And he hated unanswered questions. He looked directly at her. If your talent is real, he said slowly, then you can prove it. Her eyes lifted slightly. She already knew she wasn't going to like what came next. The other teachers seemed to sense it too. The strict instructor's voice grew colder. The showcase is in 3 days. The room became still. Her face lost color. One teacher immediately stepped in. Maybe that's two. But he raised his hand. No. His eyes remained locked on hers. You'll perform. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides. No, she said quietly. I can't. You can. I haven't played in front of people for years. Then perhaps you never could. The words hung heavily in the air. She looked at him quietly, and for the first time, the teachers saw something change in her eyes. Not anger, not fear, something deeper, something connected to a past none of them knew. But before anyone could say another word, she simply picked up her cloth from the table, walked toward the door, and left the room without saying another word, leaving for stunned teachers, and one grand piano still carrying the echo of what they had just heard. The next morning, the academy felt exactly the same on the outside. Students walked through the front doors carrying music books and backpacks. Parents stood near the entrance giving last-minute advice. Teachers moved quickly through the halls with coffee cups, lesson notes, and busy minds. Piano scales floated through open doors. Violins warmed up in practice rooms. Laughter rose from the stairways. To anyone visiting for the first time, it looked like another normal day. But inside the academy, something had changed. A quiet rumor had already started moving from room to room. It began with one teacher telling another. Then a student overheard part of a conversation. Then someone added their own version of the story. By mid-morning, nearly everyone had heard something. Some said the cleaning woman could play better than the teachers. Some said she used to be famous. Some said she had secretly trained overseas. Some thought the whole story was exaggerated. But one thing was clear. For the first time, people were talking about the woman no one had noticed before. She arrived at the academy before sunrise, just like always. She unlocked the doors. She turned on the lights. She prepared the classrooms. She wiped down music stands and polished piano lids. Her movements were calm, steady, familiar. But today felt different. People were watching her. Students who normally rushed past her now slowed down. Some whispered as she walked by. Some pretended not to stare. Others openly looked at her hands, as if expecting to see something special. A group of teenage piano students stood near the stairway as she passed. Is it really true? One whispered. That's her? Another asked quietly. She doesn't look like a performer. The woman heard them, but she kept walking. Her expression didn't change. She had spent years learning how to ignore the voices around her. Still, something inside her felt uneasy. She knew the peace she had carefully built around her life was beginning to crack. By the time the first lessons began, whispers were spreading through nearly every hallway. One student claimed a teacher had cried after hearing her play. Another said the strict piano instructor had challenged her directly. Someone else claimed she was secretly preparing for the showcase. None of it was confirmed, but rumors didn't need proof to grow. Late that morning, while she was organizing sheet music outside one of the classrooms, she heard sharp footsteps approaching. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The strict piano instructor stopped directly in front of her. His hands were folded behind his back. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried the same hard focus from the night before. "We need to talk," he said. She kept arranging the music sheets. "I'm working." His voice remained firm. "This won't take long." She slowly looked up. A few nearby students immediately became quiet. They sensed something important was happening. The instructor glanced at the students. "Classrooms. Now." They disappeared instantly. Once the hallway was empty, he looked back at her. "The showcase is in 2 days." She said nothing. "I've already added your name." Her hands stopped moving. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she carefully placed the music sheets on a nearby table. "You had no right." His expression didn't change. "Then prove me wrong." She stared at him quietly. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand." She looked away. For a brief second, something old passed across her face. Pain, memory, regret. But it disappeared just as quickly. "I'm not doing it," she said softly. He stepped closer. "Why?" She stayed silent. "Because you're afraid?" Still silence. "Or because last night was luck?" That made her eyes lift again. For the first time, there was something stronger in them. Not anger, but pride. The kind that had been buried for years. The instructor noticed it immediately, and he pressed harder. "I chose the piece myself," he said. "One of the most difficult in our library." Her fingers tightened slightly. He pulled a folded sheet of music from under his arm and placed it on the table beside her. The pages looked heavy, thick with notes, fast passages, sharp changes, complex timing. Even advanced students often avoided that piece. She looked at it without touching it. A small crowd of students had quietly gathered at the far end of the hallway, pretending not to watch. The instructor crossed his arms. "If you're truly what they say, play it." The hallway felt silent. Even the distant sound of practice rooms seemed to disappear. She stared at the sheet music for several long seconds. And then, her hand slowly reached for it. The students at the end of the hall exchanged shocked looks. She picked up the pages carefully. Her eyes moved across the notes. And suddenly, the hallway around her disappeared. The wooden floors, the walls, the students, the teachers. Everything faded as old memories came rushing back. A younger version of herself sitting in front of a piano. Bright stage lights. A crowded concert hall. Hands shaking before a competition. A voice telling her, "You were born for this." Then another memory. A hospital room. A family member holding her hand weakly. Bills stacked on a table. Dreams becoming responsibilities. Music becoming silence. She blinked. The academy hallway returned. Her breathing had changed. The instructor noticed. "You know it." She slowly folded the pages closed. "I used to." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "So it's true." She placed the music back on the table. "It doesn't matter anymore." He leaned forward slightly. "It matters now." She looked at him quietly, and for a moment, neither of them blinked. Then she turned and walked away without another word. The students immediately stepped aside as she passed. No one spoke until she disappeared around the corner. Then the whispers exploded. "She took the music. She knows the piece. She really used to perform. She's going to do it." By lunchtime, the entire academy was buzzing. Even teachers who hadn't heard her play were now asking questions. Parents waiting in the lobby overheard conversations. Office staff whispered behind desks. Students searched online for the piece she had been given. Some laughed nervously after hearing how difficult it was. Others became even more curious. Meanwhile, the woman stayed busy. She cleaned rooms, organized supplies, wiped piano benches. answered polite questions with short smiles and even shorter answers. But inside her mind was far from calm. Every time she looked at her hands, old memories returned. Every time she passed a piano, the sheet music replayed in her mind. Every note, every movement, every challenge. That evening, after most students had gone home, she entered an empty storage room and closed the door behind her. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to breathe. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. The folded music pages were still in her hands. She opened them slowly. Her eyes moved across the notes again. And this time, a quiet smile appeared. Not because the piece was easy, not because she wanted attention, but because somewhere deep inside, the part of her she had buried years ago was beginning to wake up. Outside the storage room, the strict instructor stood silently in the hallway. He hadn't meant to stop there, but when he saw the light under the door, he stayed. And as silence filled the hallway, he heard something from inside. Not fear, not crying, not hesitation, but the soft sound of someone quietly counting rhythm under her breath. The morning of the showcase arrived faster than anyone expected. From the moment the sun rose over the city, the music academy felt different. The building that was usually busy now felt alive in a completely new way. Every hallway carried excitement. Every classroom buzzed with nervous energy. Every student seemed to walk a little faster, talk a little louder, and breathe a little heavier. This was not just another recital. This was the biggest event of the year. Parents had been talking about it for weeks. Students had practiced until their fingers hurt. Teachers had spent long nights preparing every detail. Important guests from across the city were expected to attend. Some local reporters had even confirmed they would be there. By early morning, staff members were already decorating the main hall. Fresh flowers were placed near the stage. Programs were stacked neatly on welcome tables. Lights were tested again and again. The grand piano in the center of the stage shined like black glass under the overhead lights. Everything had to be perfect. And yet, no one was talking only about the students anymore. Wherever people gathered, there was only one conversation. The quiet woman. Some students believed she would back out. Some were sure she would surprise everyone. Others thought the strict instructor had gone too far by forcing her name into the program. Parents who had never met her were suddenly asking questions. Is she really the cleaner? Can she actually play? Was she a professional before? Why has nobody heard of her? Rumors had become stories. Stories had become expectations. And expectations had become pressure. She arrived before sunrise just like every other day. The streets were still quiet. The academy doors were still locked. The air was cool, and the city had not fully awakened yet. She stood in front of the building with her small bag in one hand and her ring of keys in the other. For a long moment, she didn't move. She simply looked at the old stone building. The same building where she had quietly worked for years. The same building where no one had asked about her past. The same building where everything had changed in only a few days. She took a slow breath, then unlocked the door. Inside, the hallways were silent. No students, no teachers, no whispers, just her. And the sound of her footsteps. She turned on the lights one by one. The soft glow slowly filled the empty academy. She prepared classrooms, straightened chairs, opened windows, wiped piano lids, folded cloths, organized sheet music. Her hands moved exactly as they always did. Steady, calm, careful. But inside, her heart was beating harder than usual. By mid-morning, the academy was full. Students rushed between rooms in formal clothes. Parents arrived carrying flowers and cameras. Teachers checked programs and seating lists. Staff members hurried through the hallways solving last-minute problems. Everywhere she walked, people looked at her differently now. Some smiled. Some stared. Some whispered. A few even nodded with respect. Felt strange. She had spent years being invisible. Now she couldn't walk 10 steps without someone noticing her. Near lunchtime, she entered one of the smaller practice rooms to clean a piano bench. The door had barely closed behind her when she heard a voice. "You're early." She turned. The strict instructor stood near the window, arms folded. She hadn't even noticed him. He looked calmer than usual, less sharp, less guarded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she returned to cleaning. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. He didn't move. "Neither should you." She gave the smallest smile. "That's never stopped me." Something about her answer made him pause. For the first time in days, his expression softened. He looked at her hands. "Are you ready?" She kept wiping the bench. "No." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Then why are you still here?" She finally looked at him. Her eyes were calm, but deep inside them lived years of stories no one had heard. "Because running gets tiring." He said nothing, and for the first time since meeting her, he looked almost ashamed. He lowered his eyes for a brief second before speaking again. "I shouldn't have forced you." The room became quiet. She studied his face carefully, as if deciding whether he truly meant it. Then she looked back at the piano. "Maybe you didn't." He frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" She placed the cloth down. "It means," she said softly, "sometimes people don't push us where we don't belong." She touched the piano keys lightly. "Sometimes they push us back to where we were always meant to be." The instructor didn't answer. He simply stood there, silent. And for once, he had no criticism, no challenge, no test, only respect. By evening, the showcase hall was completely full. Rows of seats stretched across the room. Parents filled every corner. Students sat in groups, whispering excitedly. Teachers moved carefully through the crowd. Important guests sat near the front. Cameras were being adjusted. Programs were being opened. The stage lights glowed warmly across the polished wooden floor, and in the center of it all sat the grand piano. Waiting. Backstage, the atmosphere felt completely different. Students stretched their fingers. Some repeated notes under their breath. Some stared at sheet music one last time. Others tried to hide how nervous they were. But among all of them, she sat alone. A small chair. A quiet corner. Her hands resting gently in her lap. Her eyes closed. Her breathing slow. No sheet music. No warm-up exercises. No panic. Just silence. One young student walked past and stopped. She looked nervous, holding her violin tightly. "Can I ask you something?" the girl whispered. The woman opened her eyes and smiled gently. "Of course." The girl hesitated. "Are you scared?" The woman looked toward the stage curtain, where light spilled through the edges. She thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yes." The girl looked surprised. "But everyone says you're amazing." The woman smiled again. "Fear doesn't disappear just because you're good at something." The girl listened carefully. "It just means what you're about to do matters." The young student nodded slowly, then smiled and walked away looking stronger than before. Minutes passed. One performance ended. Then another. Applause rose and fell. Names were called. Students walked on stage. Students walked off stage. And slowly, the program moved closer to her name. Backstage grew quieter around her. Her fingers slowly tightened. Her breathing became deeper. Old memories returned again. Bright concert halls. Crowded stages. Applause. Loss. Silence. Years away from music. Years of pretending not to miss it. Years of hearing piano notes through classroom doors and walking away. And now, no more walking away. A stage assistant approached quietly. 2 minutes. She nodded. Her hands rested on her knees. Then she stood. At the side of the curtain, the strict instructor waited. He looked at her. No challenge this time. No doubt. No test. Only quiet respect. He gave a small nod. "You don't need to prove anything tonight." She looked at him for a long second, then smiled gently. "Good," she said, "because I'm not here for them." The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. And now, the audience became quiet. Programs lowered. Whispers stopped. Eyes turned toward the stage. Backstage, her name was called. Her heart pounded once, twice, then steadied. She took one slow breath, stepped toward the light, and walked onto the stage. as an entire crowd held its breath. The moment she stepped onto the stage, the entire hall became so quiet that even the smallest sound felt louder than usual. The soft tap of her shoes against the wooden floor seemed to echo across the room. Hundreds of eyes followed her every step. Parents leaned forward in their seats. Students stopped whispering. Teachers sat straighter. Even the photographers near the front lowered their cameras for a moment, as if they didn't want to break whatever was happening. She walked slowly, not because she was weak, not because she was uncertain, but because every step carried years of silence. Years of walking through these same halls unnoticed. Years of cleaning floors while others chased dreams she once held in her own hands. Years of hearing music from behind closed doors and pretending it no longer called her name. And now every one of those silent years had brought her here. The grand piano stood under the stage lights like it had been waiting for her all along. Its polished surface reflected the glow above, shining like still water under moonlight. She reached the bench and stopped. For a brief moment, she looked out at the audience. Rows and rows of faces stared back at her. Some curious, some doubtful, some excited, some confused, and a few quietly hopeful. In the front row, the strict instructor sat with his hands folded together, his usual hard expression gone. For the first time since anyone had known him, he looked almost nervous. Students who had once whispered about her now watched with wide eyes. Some held their programs tightly in their hands. Others sat completely still, afraid even to blink. She lowered her eyes, then slowly sat down. The piano bench gave a soft sound beneath her. Her hands rested in her lap. She looked at the keys. White, black, familiar. For a few seconds, she didn't move. The silence stretched across the hall. 1 second. 2, 5, 10. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Someone near the back quietly cleared their throat. A child whispered something to a parent before being gently hushed. And still, she didn't move. Backstage, a few students exchanged nervous looks. "Is she okay?" one whispered. The strict instructor didn't take his eyes off the stage. "She's listening," he said quietly. The student looked confused. Listening to what? He didn't answer, because he wasn't completely sure himself. On stage, her breathing became slower, deeper, calmer. Then very slowly, she raised her hands. Her fingers hovered above the keys. And in that exact moment, the entire hall seemed to stop breathing. Then came the first note. Soft, so soft that some people barely heard it. But everyone felt it. It floated through the hall like a memory returning after years away. Then came the second note, and the third, and within seconds the room transformed. The music didn't sound forced. It didn't sound rehearsed. It didn't sound like someone trying to impress an audience. It sounded like truth. Her fingers moved gently at first, touching each key with quiet purpose. The melody unfolded slowly, almost like a story introducing itself one word at a time. The audience sat perfectly still. Nobody whispered. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. Then the piece began to grow. The soft opening became stronger. The rhythm became faster. The notes became deeper, more complex, more demanding. Her hands began moving across the keyboard with incredible control. Left hand, right hand, crossing, turning, rising, falling. Not a single movement looked rushed. Not a single note sounded uncertain. The impossible passages that had made advanced students nervous now flowed from her hands as naturally as breathing. One teenage piano student in the third row slowly covered his mouth with both hands. Another simply stared without blinking. A teacher near the back leaned forward so far she nearly forgot where she was. The photographers stopped taking pictures altogether. Even the reporters lowered their pens. Because writing about this suddenly felt less important than witnessing it. As the piece moved into its hardest section, the speed increased again. Her fingers became almost impossible to follow. They moved with the kind of confidence that only comes from thousands of forgotten hours. Years of practice, years of sacrifice, years of pain, and somehow, every one of those years could be heard in every note. The strict instructor sat frozen. He had chosen this piece because he thought it would expose her. He had chosen it because he believed no one could simply step back into music after years away. He had chosen it as a test. Now, sitting in the front row, he realized something painful. He had never been testing her. He had been exposing his own ignorance. His hands slowly tightened together. His eyes never left the stage. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt small. On stage, the music shifted again. The fast passages gave way to something softer, slower, deeper. And suddenly, the audience didn't just hear music anymore. They felt a life. They felt childhood dreams. They felt loss. They felt responsibilities chosen over passion. They felt long nights, quiet sacrifices, missed opportunities, unspoken pain, and somehow hope. A woman in the audience quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Then another. Then another. Soon, several people sat silently crying without fully understanding why. Some students looked confused by their own emotions. Others understood perfectly, because what they were hearing wasn't performance anymore. It was honesty, and honesty has a way of reaching places words cannot. As the final section approached, the energy changed again. Her shoulders straightened slightly. Her fingers grew stronger. Her movements became fearless. Not aggressive. Not showy. Just free. Completely free. It was as if the stage, the lights, the audience, the years away from music, none of it existed anymore. There was only her, and the piano, and the truth she had kept hidden for far too long. The final section demanded everything. Speed, precision, control, emotion, courage, and she gave all of it. Every note landed perfectly. Every pause had purpose. Every rise built tension. Every fall brought release. The audience remained frozen. No coughs. No whispers. No movement. Even children sat silently. Even the cameras stayed still. And then, the final note arrived. Her hands pressed the last chord. The sound rose through the hall like light breaking through darkness. Then slowly faded into silence. Her fingers remained on the keys. Her head remained slightly lowered. Her breathing was steady. The hall remained silent. 1 second. 2. 5. 10. No one moved. No one clapped. No one even seemed to remember how. Because in that moment, every person in that room knew they had just witnessed something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. And then, in the front row, the strict instructor slowly stood up. For a few long seconds after the final note faded, nobody in the hall moved. It was as if the music was still floating in the air, holding every person in place. The stage lights remained warm and steady. The grand piano stood silent. Her fingers still rested lightly on the keys, and her head remained slightly lowered. The crowd looked frozen. Parents sat with tears in their eyes. Students stared at the stage with wide, silent faces. Teachers who had spent years teaching music suddenly looked like beginners hearing real art for the first time. Even the reporters near the front had forgotten to write. Their pens rested quietly in their hands. Then, in the front row, the strict instructor slowly stood up. The sound of his chair moving against the floor seemed louder than anything else in the room. Every eye turned toward him for a brief moment. For years, students had known him as a man who rarely showed emotion. He praised almost no one. He accepted no excuses. He believed discipline mattered more than feelings. And now his eyes were shining. He looked at the woman on stage for several quiet seconds. His hands, which were usually folded tightly, now hung quietly at his sides. Then he began to clap. One clap, then another, then another. Slow, steady, honest. The sound echoed through the silent hall. For a second, no one else moved. It was almost as if the audience needed permission to return to reality. Then another teacher stood. Then another. Then a student. Then a parent. And within seconds, the entire hall rose to its feet. The applause exploded like thunder. The sound filled every corner of the academy. It bounced off the walls, the ceiling, the wooden stage, and the empty hallways outside. Some people cheered. Some cried openly. Some clapped so hard their hands turned red. Others simply stood there with tears running quietly down their faces. Backstage, students who had once whispered about her now looked at each other in complete disbelief. Some were smiling. Some were wiping their eyes. A few simply shook their heads, unable to find words. On stage, she slowly lifted her hands from the keys. For a moment, she didn't turn around. She simply sat there, listening to something she thought she had lost forever. Applause, respect, recognition, not because she had asked for it, not because she had chased it, but because truth had finally found its voice again. She stood up slowly. As she turned toward the audience, the applause only grew louder. Hundreds of people stood before her. Students, teachers, parents, guests, reporters, all looking at her in a way no one ever had before. Not as the quiet woman who cleaned classrooms. Not as someone in the background. Not as someone invisible. But as someone unforgettable. She placed one hand gently over her heart and gave a small, humble bow. The crowd answered with even louder applause. Near the front row, one elderly guest slowly stood from his seat. He had silver hair, kind eyes, and the careful movements of someone who had spent many years around music. He had been silent throughout the entire performance, watching closely, almost studying every note. Now he stepped toward the aisle without taking his eyes off the stage. Several teachers recognized him immediately. He was one of the Academy's oldest supporters, a retired concert organizer who had spent decades attending competitions and performances around the country. He looked up at the woman on stage, his expression filled with disbelief. Then he spoke loudly enough for the nearby rows to hear. I knew I recognized those hands. The crowd slowly grew quiet again. People looked at him with curiosity. He pointed gently toward the stage. Years ago, before many of these students were even born, there was a young pianist who performed in the National Youth Finals. The room became still. She played with the same touch. He smiled softly. The same courage. The woman on stage lowered her eyes. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides. The elderly man took another step forward. She was supposed to have a career that would take her around the world. Whispers began spreading through the crowd. Students looked at each other. Teachers leaned forward. Even the reporters quickly raised their pens again. The man's voice softened. But 1 week before her first international performance, he paused. Her family faced a tragedy. The hall remained silent. She walked away from music. He looked at her with deep respect. And no one ever heard from her again. A wave of quiet shock moved through the audience. Students stared at the stage with new understanding. Parents exchanged silent looks. Some teachers slowly lowered their eyes. And in the front row, the strict instructor looked like he had just been handed a truth he wasn't ready for. The elderly man smiled gently. Until tonight. Silence filled the hall once more. Then every eye turned back toward her. She stood quietly under the lights, her expression calm, but her eyes carried years of memories. For a moment it looked like she might remain silent. Then she stepped toward the microphone near the piano. The room became completely still. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but every single person heard it. Music never left me. The audience listened without moving. She smiled gently. I only thought I had left it. A few people quietly wiped their eyes again. She looked toward the students sitting in the middle rows. The same students who once passed her in the hall without noticing her. The same students who now watched her like she was part of something bigger than music. She took a slow breath. Life doesn't always ask what dreams we want. Her eyes moved across the crowd. Sometimes life asks what people need from us. Several parents lowered their eyes. Several teachers sat completely still. She smiled again. And sometimes, years later, her hand gently touched the piano beside her. Life gives us one more chance. The applause returned, louder than before. But this time it felt different. Deeper. More personal. More human. The strict instructor slowly walked toward the stage. Every step seemed heavier than usual. When he reached the front, he looked up at her for several quiet seconds. Then, in front of everyone, he bowed his head. Not deeply, not dramatically, just honestly. "I was wrong," he said quietly. The microphone caught every word. The audience remained silent. He looked up again. "I judged what I saw," he said, "instead of what was there." The woman smiled gently. There was no anger in her face. No pride. No bitterness. Only peace. She nodded once. And that simple gesture seemed to say more than any speech ever could. That night changed the academy forever. Students no longer walked past her without saying hello. Teachers no longer saw her as background. Parents told their children about the performance for weeks. Videos of that night quietly spread across the city. People who attended called it the most honest performance they had ever seen. But the biggest change happened inside the academy itself. Students practiced harder, but with more heart. Teachers corrected mistakes, but with more kindness. And every time someone felt invisible, they remembered the quiet woman who once cleaned empty classrooms and reminded the world that true greatness does not always stand in the spotlight. Sometimes, quietly waits beside it.